In 1983, something changed in the skies above South America. The Kremlin felt at first a ripple of disquiet running through classified briefings. Urgent cables between Moscow and Havana, generals demanding explanations that no one wanted to give. Venezuela, a nation the Soviet military establishment had largely dismissed as a minor player in the Cold War chess game, had just received the most advanced fighter aircraft in the Western Hemisphere. The General Dynamics F-16 Fighting Falcon had arrived in Caracas, and nothing would ever be the same. The generals in Moscow reportedly laughed when they first heard the news. Venezuela with F-16s. They considered it a publicity stunt, a desperate American attempt to project power in a region where Soviet influence had been growing steadily since the Cuban Revolution. After all, what could a small South American air force possibly do with such sophisticated machinery? They had seen third world nations receive advanced Western equipment before, only to watch those expensive toys gather dust in hangars while undertrained pilots struggled to maintain basic proficiency. But their laughter would soon turn to silence and then to genuine concern. Because within months of those F-16s becoming operational, something began shifting in the Caribbean. Cuban MiG pilots, who had long considered these waters their personal hunting ground, started flying differently. Patrol routes contracted, confidence evaporated. And in the years that followed, the once dominant Cuban Air Force would enter a decline from which it would never recover. What happened in those skies during the final decade of the Cold War would culminate in a moment of truth that no one anticipated when Venezuelan F-16s would finally fire their weapons in anger, not against Cuban MiGs, but in a battle for the soul of Venezuela itself. This is the story of how a small South American nation changed the balance of power in the Western Hemisphere and why Soviet generals stopped laughing when they heard the name Venezuela. If you're fascinated by these untold stories of Cold War aviation history, take a moment to hit that subscribe button and click the bell icon so you never miss our deep dives into the most compelling military events of the 20th century. And if you find this story as incredible as we do, a like really helps us bring more of these hidden histories to light. To understand why Venezuela's acquisition of the F-16 was so significant, we need to go back to the geopolitical reality of the Caribbean in the early 1980s. This was a region where the Cold War was anything but cold. Since Fidel Castro's revolution in 1959, Cuba had served as the Soviet Union's unsinkable aircraft carrier in the Western Hemisphere. Soviet bombers, reconnaissance aircraft, and most importantly, Cuban Air Force MiGs operated with near impunity throughout the region. The Soviet investment in Cuba had been enormous since the early days of the revolution. Moscow poured billions of rubles into the island nation, providing everything from oil at subsidized prices to advanced military equipment that made Cuba the most heavily armed nation in Latin America. The goal was strategic. Cuba was positioned just 90 miles from the American coast, perfectly placed to project Soviet power into what the United States had long considered its sphere of influence. The Cuban Revolutionary Air and Air Defense Force, known by its Spanish acronym DAFAR, built itself into one of the most formidable air forces in the Americas, outside of the United States. By the early 1980s, Cuba possessed over 200 combat aircraft, including advanced MiG-23 floggers that had been delivered starting in 1978. These swing-wing fighters represented a quantum leap in capability over the older MiG-21s that had previously formed the backbone of Cuban air power. The MiG-23 was a formidable machine by any standard. Designed in response to the American F-4 Phantom, could reach speeds of Mach 2.35 and carried a sophisticated weapons package that included air-to-air missiles and a powerful twin-barrel cannon. The swing-wing design allowed it to optimize its aerodynamics for different phases of flight, sweeping the wings back for high-speed interception and bringing them forward for better handling during combat maneuvering. By the mid-1980s, Cuba would operate approximately 45 of these aircraft. Soviet advisors were everywhere in Cuba. Officially, they were there only in a training and support capacity. Unofficially, everyone in the intelligence community knew that Soviet personnel played a significant role in Cuban military operations, gathering intelligence on American naval movements, testing American air defense responses, and maintaining a constant state of readiness for a potential conflict that seemed all too possible during those tense years. Just how seriously Cuba took its offensive capability became clear in October 1983, when the United States invaded Grenada. Cuban commanders armed their MiG-23B and prepared contingency plans to strike targets in Florida, including Homestead Air Force Base and the Turkey Point nuclear reactor. The invasion of the small Caribbean island was seen in Havana as a potential precursor to an assault on Cuba itself. The MiGs stood ready on alert, waiting for orders that thankfully never came. This was the Caribbean of the early 1980s. Cuban submarines prowled the deep waters between the islands, using Cuban ports as forward bases that extended their operational range far beyond what would otherwise have been possible. Intelligence ships monitored every American communication they could intercept. Electronic surveillance stations dotted the Cuban landscape, their antenna arrays pointed north toward the United States. And Cuban pilots flew with the confidence of men who knew they faced no real opposition south of the Florida Keys. Venezuela, despite its oil wealth and strategic importance, had been relegated to a secondary role in hemispheric defense. The Venezuelan Air Force flew aging aircraft that were no match for the Cuban MiGs. Their fighter inventory included Mirage 3 and Mirage V aircraft, along with Canadar's CF-5 Freedom fighters capable but limited aircraft that had been designed in the early 1960s. Against the MiG-23s that Cuba was now operating, these jets were outclassed in almost every measurable way. The CF-5 was essentially an export version of the American F-5 Tiger, a lightweight fighter designed for allied nations that could not afford or support more sophisticated aircraft. It was fast and maneuverable for its era, but it lacked the powerful radar, the long-range missiles, and the raw performance that characterized newer generation fighters. In a head-to-head confrontation with the MiG-23, the outcome would likely favor the Soviet-built aircraft significantly. This imbalance had real consequences. Venezuelan oil supply lines to the United States ran through waters where Cuban aircraft could operate freely. The strategic implications were not lost on Venezuelan military planners. The modern MiG-23 floggers of the Cuban Air Force posed a genuine threat to Venezuelan crude oil shipments. Concern that weighed heavily when Venezuelan commanders began evaluating candidates for a new fourth-generation fighter. The Venezuelan military leadership understood that they were facing a slow-motion erosion of their strategic position. Senior officers who served during this period later described the frustration of watching Cuban aircraft operate with impunity in waters that Venezuela considered vital to its national interests. The oil wealth that flowed from the Venezuelan economy, the strategic importance of their position on the Caribbean coast of South America, the historical pride of a nation that had produced Simon Bolivar, the liberator of much of South America, of these factors created pressure for change. The decision to pursue F-16s came after years of evaluation and failed attempts to find a suitable counter to Cuban air power. Venezuela had explored options with the French, looking at the Mirage 2000. They evaluated the Swedish Vegan. They even considered upgraded versions of aircraft they already operated. But each alternative came with complications. Some couldn't offer the performance Venezuela needed. Others were politically complicated or came with technology transfer demands that didn't align with the strategic situation. The F-16 represented something different entirely. It was the most advanced, lightweight fighter in the world. A product of the American fighter mafia's push for air combat capability above all else. The Fighting Falcon, as it was officially known, had been designed from the ground up to win dogfights. Its fly-by-wire controls, its bubble canopy with 360-degree visibility, its 9G sustained maneuvering capability, all of these features made it the most lethal air-to-air platform of its generation. The story of the F-16's development is itself a fascinating chapter in aviation history. It began in the late 1960s when a group of visionary military reformers became convinced that American fighter design had gone badly wrong. Aircraft like the F-4 Phantom had grown too large, too complex, too focused on systems and capabilities that had little to do with the fundamental mission of air combat. These reformers, who called themselves the Fighter Mafia, pushed for a return to basics. Their vision was for a small, agile fighter that would excel in visual-range dogfighting. They wanted an aircraft that could outturn, outclimb, and out-accelerate any opponent. They believed that the pilot, not the technology, should be the decisive factor in air combat. The F-16 was the result of that vision, a fighter that combined cutting-edge technology with the fundamental principles of successful air combat that had been proven from the First World War through Vietnam. But acquiring F-16s was not simply a matter of writing a check. The United States maintained strict controls on who could purchase its most advanced military technology. Initially, the Carter administration wanted to sell Venezuela the F-16 79's downgraded variant powered by the less capable General Electric J-79 engine used in the F-4 Phantom. This export-configured version would have ensured that foreign customers received a lesser aircraft compared to what American squadrons flew. Venezuela pushed back. They wanted the real thing. The Reagan administration, which came to power in 1981, viewed the Caribbean basin as a critical theater in the Cold War. The Soviets and their Cuban allies were increasingly active in the region, supporting Marxist movements in Central America, projecting power into the Caribbean islands, and working to undermine American influence throughout Latin America. A strong Venezuela could be a valuable counterweight to Cuban power. The negotiations intensified. American congressional delegations visited Caracas. Venezuelan military officers traveled to the United States for evaluation programs. Intelligence assessments examined every aspect of Venezuelan politics and society, looking for weaknesses that might compromise the aircraft if they were delivered. The Venezuelan government responded with comprehensive programs to address American reservations, establishing new security protocols and expanding military education programs. In May 1982, Venezuela signed a foreign military sales agreement under the Peace Delta program. The deal provided for 16 single-seat F-16s, as an 8 two-seat F-16. BSL built to the Block 15 standard with the full capability Pratt & Whitney F-100 engine. The aircraft would come equipped with an APG-66 radar, Westinghouse fire control systems, and 150 AIM-9 LP-4 Sidewinder air-to-air missiles. Venezuela would be the first nation in South America to operate the F-16 and would remain the only one for more than 2 decades. The announcement sent shockwaves through the region. In Havana, Cuban military leaders demanded an assessment of what this development meant for their operational planning. In Moscow, analysts scrambled to understand the implications for Soviet strategy in the Western Hemisphere. In Washington, officials celebrated what they saw as a major victory in the Cold War competition for influence in Latin America. Western intelligence analysts later assessed that Soviet military planners likely dismissed Venezuela as incapable of operating such sophisticated aircraft. The pattern was familiar. They had seen Egypt struggle to maintain its Soviet-supplied equipment after breaking with Moscow. They had watched as advanced aircraft delivered to various African nations quickly became non-operational due to maintenance failures. They apparently assumed Venezuela would follow the same pattern. It's unable to support the sophisticated technology that made the F-16 so formidable. This assessment would prove spectacularly wrong. What the Soviets failed to understand was that Venezuela was not approaching this acquisition like other developing nations that had purchased advanced Western equipment only to watch it deteriorate. The Venezuelan Air Force had studied the failures of other countries and was determined not to repeat them. They invested heavily in infrastructure, training programs, and maintenance capabilities that would allow them to operate the F-16 at its full potential. The cornerstone of this effort was the pilot training program. Venezuela sent its best aviators to Luke Air Force Base in Arizona, the primary training facility for F-16 pilots worldwide. Luke, located in the Arizona desert, had been training fighter pilots since World War II. Its ideal weather conditions allowed for year-round flying, and its remote location provided vast expanses of airspace for training exercises. The facilities and expertise concentrated there represented the finest fighter pilot training program in the world. These Venezuelan pilots, hand-selected from the most experienced aviators in their Air Force, spent months learning not just how to fly the F-16, but how to fight with it. They learned American air combat doctrine. They practiced against aggressor squadrons flying simulated Soviet tactics. They flew more training hours in a few months than most pilots accumulate in years. When they returned to Venezuela, they were not just F-16 pilots. They were F-16 combat pilots, trained to the same standards as their American counterparts. The selection process for these pilots was rigorous in the extreme. Only officers with perfect flight records were considered. Candidates underwent extensive physical and psychological testing. The men who were finally chosen represented the absolute elite of Venezuelan military aviation. The training in the United States exposed them to a military culture that emphasized individual initiative and aggressive tactics, an attitude they absorbed eagerly and would later put to devastating use. The first F-16s arrived in Venezuela in September 1983. The aircraft were assigned to the newly formed Grupo Aéreo de Caza 16th, the 16th Fighter Air Group based at El Libertador Air Base near Palo Negro. The unit was nicknamed Los Dragones, the Dragons. 2 squadrons were established, the 161st Curibes and 162nd Gaviotas. Deliveries would continue through 1985 until all 24 aircraft had arrived. The delivery ceremony was carefully orchestrated to send a message. Venezuelan President Luis Herrera Campins attended, along with a delegation of American officials and military officers. The Venezuelan pilots who would fly these aircraft stood at attention as the jets were unveiled, their faces showing the mixture of pride and determination that came with knowing they were about to become the first line of defense against any threat to Venezuelan sovereignty. The aircraft themselves gleamed in the tropical sun factory fresh aluminum, catching the light. Canopies tinted gold, heat shimmering off the tarmac where ground crews worked in the tropical heat. The General Dynamics logo on the fuselage reminded everyone of the American industrial might that had produced these machines. The Venezuelan roundel on the tail marked them as the property of a nation that was no longer willing to accept second-class status in its own skies. Senior Venezuelan Air Force officers made clear in their public statements that Venezuela would no longer tolerate violations of its sovereign airspace. The message to Havana and Moscow was unmistakable. Venezuela now possessed fighters that could match or exceed anything the Cubans could put in the air. The implications rippled throughout the region. Until the delivery of the first Mirage 2000s to the Peruvian Air Force in 1987, the F-16s of the Venezuelan Air Force would be the most advanced multi-role fighters in service anywhere in South America. For the first time in decades, Cuba did not have air superiority in the Caribbean. To understand why the F-16 was so transformative, one must understand the physics of air combat. The F-16, a Block 15 that Venezuela operated, could reach speeds just over Mach 2 at altitude, actually slightly slower than the MiG-23's Mach 2.35 top speed. But top speed was never the F-16's advantage. In the brutal calculus of dogfighting, other factors mattered far more. The F-16's thrust-weight ratio exceeded 1:1, meaning it could accelerate straight up like a rocket if needed. Its digital fly-by-wire flight control system allowed pilots to push the aircraft to its structural limits. 9 gigaseconds of sustained turning force without fear of departure from controlled flight. The airframe was designed around the pilot, the reclined ejection seat that allowed aviators to better withstand the crushing G-forces of combat maneuvering. The MiG-23, by contrast, was a heavier aircraft with a swing-wing design that created significant handling challenges during rapid maneuvering. Its variable geometry wings were an engineering marvel, but they added weight and complexity. In a turning fight, the F-16 could get inside the MiG's turn radius, positioning itself for a shot while the opposing pilot struggled to bring his nose around. The performance envelope simply wasn't comparable. Then there was the matter of situational awareness. The F-16's bubble canopy gave Venezuelan pilots visibility that their potential adversaries could only dream of. A pilot sitting in an F-16 cockpit could see in every direction without obstruction. He could look directly behind him to check for threats. He could scan the entire sky from horizon to horizon without moving his head more than a few degrees. The MiG-23's cockpit, by comparison, offered far more limited visibility, with structural members and canopy frames blocking significant portions of the pilot's view. In air combat, where the pilot who sees first usually wins, this was a decisive advantage. The F-16's and APG-66 radar added another dimension of superiority. This pulse Doppler system gave Venezuelan pilots Lutown's shoot-down capability, the ability to detect and engage targets flying below them against the ground clutter that confused older radar systems. Combined with the AIM-9L Sidewinder's All-Aspect engagement capability, Venezuelan pilots could engage targets from angles that would have been impossible with previous generation weapons. What happened after the F-16s became operational would remain the subject of speculation and classified briefings for decades. There were no dramatic dogfights that made international headlines. No missiles were fired at Cuban aircraft. No shoot-downs occurred in the Caribbean skies. But aviation historians who have studied this period suggest that the absence of spectacular combat footage tells only part of the story. The real impact was measured in what didn't happen. Intelligence analysts observed that Cuban aircraft operating near Venezuelan Airspace became notably more cautious after 1983. Patrol routes that had previously pushed into areas of Venezuelan interest began contracting. Training sorties near Venezuelan waters decreased. The aggressive posture that had characterized Cuban air operations for decades seemed to soften, though proving direct causation remained difficult. Veterans of the Venezuelan F-16 program, speaking years later in retirement interviews, described a systematic effort to demonstrate capability to any potential adversary. When Venezuelan radar detected aircraft approaching their airspace, F-16s would scramble and intercept at maximum range. The goal was to make absolutely clear that any aircraft entering Venezuelan territory without authorization would be met by fighters that could destroy them with ease. One former Venezuelan pilot, speaking to aviation journalists decades after his retirement, described the psychology of these encounters. "We would appear on their radar screens far sooner than they expected. We would close to visual range before they could react. We showed them what we could do, and they understood." Whether Cuban pilots experienced a crisis of confidence, as some Western analysts suggested, or whether the change in Cuban behavior reflected broader strategic recalculations, the practical effect was the same. The Caribbean was no longer uncontested airspace. There was a new factor in the equation. The Soviets attempted to respond to the changing situation. In the late 1980s, there were discussions about providing Cuba with MiG-29 Fulcrum aircraft, true fourth-generation fighters designed specifically to counter the F-16 and similar Western aircraft. Plans called for 35 to 45 of these advanced jets. The MiG-29 represented the Soviet Union's best hope for matching Western fighter capability, with thrust-to-weight ratio and maneuverability that finally approached American standards. But the full MiG-29 transfer never happened. The aircraft was too expensive for Cuba to operate without massive Soviet subsidies. The infrastructure requirements were beyond what the Cuban Air Force could support. Economic pressures on the Soviet system were becoming impossible to ignore. Oil prices had collapsed in the mid-1980s. The war in Afghanistan was draining resources, and Gorbachev's reforms were creating uncertainty throughout the communist world. In the end, Cuba received only 12 MiG-29 fighters and 2 Trinoza, a fraction of what had been planned. For the critical years of the late Cold War, the balance of power in the Caribbean remained firmly tilted toward Venezuela. To understand what was happening inside the Cuban Air Force during these years, one need only look at the story of Major Orestes Lorenzo Perez on March 20, 1991. Lorenzo climbed into the cockpit of MiG-23B NFAR 722 at his Cuban air base, ostensibly for a routine training flight. Instead, he pointed his aircraft north and pushed the throttle forward. Minutes later, he landed at Naval Air Station Key West, Florida defector. Lorenzo was not a malcontent or a political agitator. He was one of Cuba's best pilots. A veteran of more than 40 combat sorties, flying MiG-21s in Angola during Cuba's long intervention in that African conflict. He had seen what modern air combat looked like. He understood exactly where Cuba stood in the hierarchy of air power. And he had made his decision. What makes Lorenzo's story truly remarkable is what happened next. He had been forced to leave his wife and 2 young sons behind in Cuba. The regime refused to let them leave. Every legal avenue, every diplomatic channel, every humanitarian appeal was blocked. Cuba would not release his family. So on December 19, 1992, Orestes Lorenzo rented a Cessna 310 in Florida, filed a flight plan for the Bahamas, and then turned south. Flying low to avoid radar, he crossed into Cuban airspace and landed on a highway near Veradero, where his wife and children were waiting. He loaded his family into the small aircraft and took off again, threading his way back through Cuban air defenses to freedom. The Cuban Air Force, with all its MiGs and all its Soviet training, could not stop a single man in a rented Cessna from penetrating their airspace, landing and escaping with his family. Lorenzo later wrote about his experiences in his book, Wings of the Morning, providing a rare insider's glimpse into the state of Cuban military aviation, Air Force, that looked formidable on paper but was hollowing out from within. For 9 years, Venezuelan F-16 pilots had trained for a confrontation that never came. They had practiced intercepts, perfected their tactics, maintained their aircraft at extraordinary readiness rates. They had proven that a determined nation could operate the world's most advanced fighters at the highest professional standards. but they had never fired their weapons in anger. That changed on November 27, 1992. The target was not Cuban MiGs, it was their own countrymen. A faction of military officers loyal to Lieutenant Colonel Hugo Chavez, who had led a failed coup attempt in February of that year, launched a second attempt to overthrow the government of President Carlos Andrés Pérez. Rebel units seized several air bases. Aircraft took to the skies on both sides. For the first time, Venezuelan F-16s would prove their worth in actual combat. The engagement was brief and decisive. Government-loyal F-16 pilots intercepted rebel aircraft attempting to support the coup. Lieutenant Beltran Vilma, flying an F-16A, engaged and shot down an OV-10 Bronco being flown by rebel forces. Other engagements followed. When the smoke cleared, F-16 pilots loyal to the government had scored at least 3 confirmed aerial victories. The coup failed. Chavez was captured and imprisoned. The F-16s had proven themselves not through deterrence alone, but through actual combat performance. Venezuelan pilots, trained at Luque Air Force Base, flying American-built fighters, had demonstrated in the most definitive way possible that they could fight and win. It was not the confrontation anyone had anticipated. The enemy was not Cuban or Soviet, but Venezuelan. Yet the engagement proved everything that the F-16 acquisition had promised. When the moment came, when lives were on the line and the fate of a nation hung in the balance, the aircraft performed and the pilots delivered. The irony would become apparent only later. Hugo Chavez, whose coup the F-16s helped defeat, would eventually come to power through democratic elections in 1998. His government would turn hostile to the United States, leading to an arms embargo that would slowly strangle the very F-16 program that had once saved Venezuelan democracy from his rebellion. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the subsequent collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 marked the end of an era. The Cold War was over, and with it, the massive Soviet investment in Cuban military power. The Cuban Air Force, already facing the challenge of Venezuelan F-16s, entered a period of steep decline from which it would never recover. The special period, as it came to be known in Cuba, was devastating for the military. Without Soviet oil subsidies, fuel for aircraft became scarce. Without Soviet spare parts, maintenance became impossible. Pilots who had once flown dozens of hours per month found themselves grounded for months at a time. The proud Air Force that had once been the most powerful in Latin America was reduced to a shadow of its former self. By the late 1990s, Western analysts assessed the Cuban Air Force as having fewer than 24 operational fighters. Pilot training had declined to barely adequate levels. The number of sorties had collapsed. The MiG-23s that had once seemed so formidable were aging out of service, and the handful of MiG-29s that had actually been delivered could not fill the gap. Venezuela's F-16s, meanwhile, continued to serve with distinction. The original aircraft were upgraded over the years. Plans were discussed to re-engine them with more powerful F-1 UPW-220E power plants. Venezuelan pilots continued to train with their American counterparts and participated in international exercises like Cruzex in Brazil, where they consistently demonstrated their professionalism. But the political winds were shifting. When Hugo Chavez finally came to power in 1999, he inherited an air force equipped with the very F-16s that had helped defeat his 1992 coup. The relationship between Caracas and Washington deteriorated steadily. By 2006, the United States had imposed an arms embargo on Venezuela, cutting off the spare parts and support that the F-16 fleet required. Venezuela turned to Russia, purchasing 24 Su-30 Mk2 fighters between 2006 and 2008. These aircrafts, ironically, distant descendants of the Soviet fighters that Venezuela's F-16s had been purchased to, became the backbone of Venezuelan air power. The F-16s, starved of parts and support, began a slow decline. Today, estimates suggest that only 3 to 4 Venezuelan F-16s remain operational, kept flying through cannibalization of other airframes and black market acquisition of parts. In March 2024, during a training exercise, observers noted just 3 F-16s in the flight line, a far cry from the 24 aircraft that had once formed the most capable fighter force in South America. And in September 2025, those aging F-16s made headlines again when a pair of them conducted an aggressive flyby of the USS Jason Dunham a U.S. Navy destroyer operating in international waters, American-built fighters, purchased to counter Soviet power, now being used to threaten American ships. The Cold War's strange echoes continue to reverberate. Looking back at this period from the perspective of today, the Venezuelan F-16 program stands as one of the most successful military acquisitions in Latin American history and one of the strangest. A relatively modest investment transformed the strategic balance in an entire region. It neutralized a threat that had seemed insurmountable, deterred aggression without firing a shot at the intended adversary, and demonstrated that smaller nations could effectively defend themselves against larger powers if they made smart choices about military investment. Then those same aircraft proved their worth in actual combat against a domestic enemy rather than a foreign one. And finally, the nation that had purchased them turned hostile to the nation that had built them, creating one of the most unusual situations in modern military aviation. American fighters serving a government that views America as an adversary. The Cuban Air Force that the F-16s were purchased to counter has largely ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. Of the proud fleet of MiG-21s, MiG-23s, and MiG-29s that once dominated the Caribbean, only a handful remain operational. The special period and the decades that followed have reduced Cuban military aviation to what some analysts describe as a flying museum, vintage cold. War aircraft kept operational through heroic maintenance efforts but posing no real offensive threat. The lessons of this chapter in Cold War history remain relevant today. Technology matters in military competition, but only when paired with training, maintenance, and institutional commitment. Deterrence works when it is backed by genuine capability and demonstrated will. And sometimes the most significant victories are the ones that never make the headlines, the battles that were never fought because one side made the calculation that fighting was hopeless. The Soviet analysts who predicted that Venezuela would fail to maintain its F-16s learned these lessons the hard way. They discovered that their assumptions about developing world military capability were dangerously wrong. They found that their Cuban allies, despite decades of investment and support, could not match a determined adversary with superior technology and training. And they watched as their influence in the Caribbean, painstakingly built over a quarter century, began to erode under the pressure of a threat they had dismissed. The Caribbean skies have grown quiet in the decades since the Cold War ended. The tensions of that era have given way to different challenges and different threats. Cuban MiGs no longer probe Venezuelan airspace. Soviet submarines no longer prowl the deep waters between the islands. The great ideological struggle that defined the second half of the 20th century has passed into history. But for those who remember what it was like when Cuban aircraft flew with impunity through the region, when Soviet power seemed ascendant in America's backyard, when it seemed like the Western Hemisphere might slowly fall under Moscow's shadow, the story of Venezuela's F-16s remains a powerful reminder of how quickly the tide can turn. Those 24 aircraft, delivered beginning in September 1983, did more than defend Venezuelan airspace. They demonstrated that the Cold War could be contested and won in ways that the superpowers never anticipated. They proved that courage and capability could overcome ideology and intimidation. They showed that a nation of modest size but strong will could stand up to a superpower's proxy and prevail. And when the ultimate test came not against Cuban MiGs but against Venezuelan rebels, they proved themselves in the only way that ultimately matters. They fought and they won. Major Orestes Lorenzo, the Cuban pilot who defected and then flew back to rescue his family, understood something essential about air power that transcends ideology and borders. It's not just about the machines, it's about the men who fly them, the nations that support them, and the will to use them when everything is on the line. Venezuela made that commitment in 1982 when they signed the Peace Delta Agreement. They proved it in November 1992 when their F-16s flew into combat. And they continued to demonstrate it today, keeping a handful of aging fighters operational against all odds. A testament to the institutional culture that was built 4 decades ago at Luke Air Force Base in the Arizona desert. The generals in Moscow stopped laughing eventually. Some of them came to understand what had happened, to recognize that they had been wrong. Others went to their graves still making excuses, still refusing to admit that a small South American nation had challenged their grand strategy without ever firing a shot at their allies. But the truth was written in the changing patrol patterns, in the contracted operational areas, in the slow decline of a once proud Cuban Air Force that never recovered its confidence or its capability. This was the Cold War at its most subtle a conflict, fought not with missiles and bombs, with presence and capability, and the simple message that aggression would not be tolerated. Venezuela sent that message with 24 F-16 Fighting Falcons. The intended adversary received it clearly. And then, in an irony that captures the strange twists of history, those same aircraft turned their weapons on Venezuelans defending democracy against a coup that would ultimately prove merely delayed. The man whose rebellion they helped defeat would later become president. The aircraft that saved Venezuelan democracy would become symbols of a government hostile to the nation that built them. History rarely offers clean endings. The story of Venezuela's F-16s is no exception. The next time someone tells you that a single weapon system cannot change history, remember Venezuela's F-16s. Remember the Cuban Air Force that contracted its operations when faced with a superior threat. Remember Orestes Lorenzo, flying a rented Cessna through the airspace that MiGs couldn't protect. Remember November 1992, when the theoretical capability became proven performance. And remember that sometimes the most important victories are the ones that never make the news, the confrontations that never happened because one side looked at the odds and decided that discretion was the better part of valor. The skies over the Caribbean are peaceful now, but they were shaped by decisions made 40 years ago. Every flight path, every territorial understanding, every calculation about what is possible and what is not traces back in some way to the events of the 1980s, Venezuela's decision to acquire F-16s did not just affect the Cold War, it shaped the region for generations to come. That is the true story of how Soviet generals stopped laughing about Venezuela's F-16s. It is a story about technology and training, about courage and commitment, about the way that power shifts when one side possesses capabilities that the other cannot match. It is a story that deserves to be remembered. With all its complexities and contradictions, the Cold War is over. The aircraft are aging. Political alignments have shifted in ways no one could have predicted. The lessons endure. Capability matters. Training matters. Institutional commitment matters. And sometimes, a small nation can change the course of history with 24 aircraft and the will to use them. Thank you for joining us on this journey through one of the Cold War's most fascinating untold stories. If you enjoyed this deep dive into aviation history, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you'll be the first to know when we release our next exploration of the conflicts that shaped our world. Your likes and comments help us continue bringing you these incredible stories. So take a moment to let us know what you think. What other Cold War mysteries would you like us to investigate? Let us know in the comments below. Till next time, keep looking up at those skies and wondering about the stories they could tell.